Good morning, everybody, or as we said, afternoon or evening. I'll load up my slides here, and I'll just say I put together some slides with the idea that visual eye candy would maybe keep this interesting. And we'll see, how much discussion ensues from this, but certainly as we move along, what I hope to do with this presentation is really just to talk to you a little bit about some of the ethnobotanical work that I do along with my students, and a little bit of how I got to where I am as a practicing ethnobotanist and kind of the strange path that has led me to where I am. And a big part of today's topic is going to be around agroforestry. So I'll talk a little bit about how agroforestry has become a vehicle or the context for a lot of the work that I do. And I say that from the standpoint of I work and teach, and actually right now chair the program in forestry at Penn State University. Although I've been trained as a forester, that's not what I do. I do agroforestry. And so, as an ethnobotanist, I've had to be creative all the way from being an undergraduate up till now into how I do ethnobotany. And so I'll pepper that in as we go through, but I'll just start out by saying that I've been a member of the Society for Ethnobotany, but also Economic Botany since I was an undergraduate. And my undergraduate was done in Idaho State back in the 1990s. At that time, agroforestry was not very popular. Some might argue it's still not, but as I hope to share with you as we move along today, it has come full circle from being something that is a traditional ecological practice that has kind of been focus of the neotropics and tropics, and more recently come to the temperate zone, and now is a major part of at least our temperate zone policy in dealing with climate change and climate resiliency. And so while agroforestry has kind of gone through this evolution, I'd say ethnobotany as well has gone through an evolution, at least in my mind. I started out probably like many of you with this idea of just thinking about how people use plants and finding that fascinating and wanting to study that. And certainly that is still part of what I do. But I saw Daniel Moorman jump on a little bit ago. He wrote an essay or an opinion piece, I think, years ago in the journal talking about that the field can be more than just writing plant lists, right? And getting us to think about like what ethnobotany can actually accomplish given all of the challenges that we face today in the world. And I'm here to say that I think ethnobotany has a lot of contemporary roles to play. And so I'll kind of dip into that as we move forward today with some of these slides and some of the work that I do. It is about studying people's use of plants, but it's also about understanding how that endeavor can actually guide other practices, right? And other goals, such as sustainable development and adaptation to climate change and social equity, and development of new medicines and culinary products and so on. So anyway, that's enough intro to say that I'm on Instagram. If any of you are on Instagram, you can connect with me there, and I look forward to connecting with people around this circle. There's a good number of folks here at this time. So I'm going to start out just by talking about non-timber forest products. As an undergraduate, I became very aware of this whole kind of category of things that come from forest lands that aren't necessarily timber. And back when I was an undergraduate in the 90s, non-timber forest products were being explored as something that could be used as a vehicle for sustainable development, particularly places like the Amazon, where a lot of deforestation and developmental pressures still are being applied. And as an undergraduate in the temperate zone, I started to think about whether this held any kind of, credibility for the temperate zone, the United States in particular, but North America more broadly. That is, what are non-timber forest products in the United States, and can this have a very similar sort of value? So I'll just point out that these things called non-timber forest products have also evolved over the last 20 years that I've been in this field. And now you can find lots of websites and information. And generally, we talk about them as falling into 4 different categories. These are medicinal plants, edible plants, floral plants, and things that often end up in kind of strange places like Michael's Crafts. for those who know North American consumer outlets. So these things are all things that come from the forest that are not necessarily timber, that can somehow make their way into formal and informal commodity chains. And as I mentioned, for many, many decades, people have been looking at commercialization of non-timber forest products as something that is maybe a way to encourage biodiversity in agricultural systems, but also to encourage thoughtful conservation of many products that are not timber or, let's say, well-known commodity items in forested ecosystems as a way of developing those forest ecosystems, or at least the economics around them. One of the things that we've realized, though, and part of what I'm going to focus on in the rest of my slides, is really this idea that you have to approach this with clear visuals. That is, there's a lot of opportunity here, but there's a lot of challenges. And so a lot of the work that I do across Appalachian, as I'll share a little bit in the Neotropics, is aimed at some of the questions that underlie this very simple idea of commercializing non-timber forest products, developing new crops and new medicinal plants into commercial items that then presumably can bring not only benefit to consumers from a consumption standpoint, but also to the producers from an economic standpoint and hopefully sustainable development standpoint. Within non-timber forest products, we have this idea of management, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about forest farming as the type of agroforestry. So I just want to mention briefly that there's all kinds of options that we have available with non-timber forest products. And so that's part of what we think about is, do we encourage wild stewardship of them? Or do we encourage someone to cultivate them full-blown outside of the forest? Or, as I'll share a little bit with some of the slides, are there these other kinds of nuanced or gray areas of domestication that we can encourage people to participate in these supply chains, right? And sometimes this is known as wild simulated production in the United States these days, this idea of intentionally producing something as if it's wild. And then some days we try and marry horticultural methods into these systems, and we call that woods cultivated. So we're taking this a little bit further down a spectrum. In the United States, this then has intersection with agroforestry, and that's largely what we're going to talk about. So non-timber forest products are being promoted as crops within agroforestry practices, things that would encourage folks to plant trees. I mentioned just briefly earlier that part of our national climate change resilience strategy, if you will, in the United States is to promote agroforestry. And a big part of that is because trees, quite frankly, sequester a lot of carbon, especially when you plant them and they are growing. And so one of the ideas moving forward is to promote more and more agroforestry into the landscape. Agroforestry, I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with what agroforestry is, but the short story is we're trying to integrate, as I'll share, multiple kind of layers of cropping, often involving woody long-term crops with understory species, and that could include plants and livestock here in the United States. We do have a National Agroforestry Center based out of all places, Nebraska. But part of that is a historical kind of development during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl era of the need for trees in the landscape in North America. Agroforestry, no matter where it's practiced around the world, we often talk about in terms of the 4 I's. And so one of the things I'll quickly share with you is agroforestry is first and foremost intentional. So a lot of the time, one of the things I realized as an undergraduate spending time in Nicaragua is that people that were doing agroforestry were not calling it agroforestry, but it absolutely was agroforestry. And how did I know that? Because it checked these boxes. First and foremost, it's an intentional practice. So it's something that people are managing these long-term cropping situations with intention. And that's, doesn't seem maybe so odd to us, but just keep in mind that, especially in this day and age, a lot of commercial agriculture is focused very much towards annual crops. And so this idea of diversity and of perennial systems is something that, we kind of have to rethink and reacquaint ourselves with in some cases. So the idea is that we're planning over the long term this intentional kind of sequence and diversity of species that we're going to grow together in these integrated systems that are often intensive and interactive. And so what we mean there is that they work together. We think about them strategically, again, intentionally. Oftentimes, because there are multiple layers and multiple crops involved, there is an intensiveness associated with it that we have to think about. That's part of the labor. Labor is oftentimes one of the most costly parts of agroforestry in a space like the United States, just because of the cost of labor, but maybe it's not necessarily an issue in other parts of the world, aside from, people devoting their opportunities to doing this instead of something else. Okay, these 5 practices, plus one, we call it short rotation woody crops, but 5 practices in the United States that we call agroforestry include riparian forest buffers, alley cropping, silvopastures, windbreaks, forest farming. All of these things have a role to play and have intention and design around them. One of the things I'll talk briefly about today, I'm going to focus largely on the practice I work with, which is forest farming. But I'll talk about the fact that one of the things we're doing here in the United States is developing these technical criteria for how you set these systems up. That is, how do they become functional windbreaks, right? What kinds of things do you pay attention to? So that's been a big part of agroforestry in the United States, or let's say the last 25, 30 years, is developing the science behind the practices. Okay, all of these practices, as I mentioned, have a role to play in the landscape. Agroforestry is often thought of as something that we start in an open setting. It may not be a pasture, but it's an open setting where we're going to plant longer term woody crops, or at least manage these systems. So you might think about in the tropics and neotropics slash and burn systems, where you're starting with some sort of disturbed open environment and you're going to manage that. In fact, as an undergraduate in Nicaragua, that was my first exposure to agroforestry, and why I became interested is people were essentially doing these longer term rotations in lowland tropical rainforests, where they would cut down the forest and then manage through a series of kind of successive stages these perennial cropping systems, right? And so this represents kind of a different set of ways that we do this. We can start with open conditions like I just described, or what I largely work with here in Pennsylvania and Appalachia is illustrated by the top and the bottom, which is what we call forest farming or forest gardening, which is we start with some sort of closed canopy, or we're seeking to establish one. So we are creating forest conditions or managing for those forest conditions, which is different than the rest of the agroforestry practices, which typically are used in open conditions, in agricultural landscapes, if you will, or urbanized landscapes. So an example, this is a forest gardening situation. These are hybrid poplars that are being used to create shade in open grown conditions, to create essentially conducive environment for understory crops to be grown. So, there's a lot of questions that go into systems like this, and this is part of what I've been studying for a couple of decades now, which is, what's everything from how do you do this, which species work best together, which species economically would fit well together, and some of the work that, for example, Savannah's working on, which is understanding what's in some of these plants and how to best produce them. And so this is as I mentioned, a multi-layered system that we're trying to think about. And many traditional practices around the world, including here in North America, have followed for millennia these types of practices, where we're thinking about strategic integration of multiple strata, of multiple time horizons together in the same space. How many of these layers we put together is a matter of where we are and our ambitions and opportunities and all that sort of thing. But it's a very old practice, right, that we are now trying to put back into the landscape, this idea of agroforestry and using non-timber forest products as crops within agroforestry systems. Okay. As I mentioned, the practice I largely work with is called forest farming. This specifically is a practice where we are either trying to create as quickly as possible and mimic forest conditions, or more often than not, we are taking forest lands that are being managed as forest lands and trying to think about other opportunities to engage people in those forest lands. And by that, I mean, in a broad sense, people oftentimes are not doing this type of plant or mushroom management from a commercial standpoint, but are simply interested in food security issues, or maybe for enhancing their dietary diversity, right? So especially since the pandemic, we have a lot of people who are super interested in managing foodscapes, things in the wild, foraging, right? Those types of things. So forest farming is a broad suite of practices that includes commercially oriented kinds of operations, but oftentimes starts with just a very simple act of people getting interested in how they manage species on forest lands. Okay? And the benefit from a commercial standpoint that we often look at with forest farming is that many of the so-called crops, the non-timber forest products that we might grow in these systems, if we remove them from the systems, we run into a lot of different costs and issues that pop up. One of the biggest costs comes about with the need for shade. So many of these crops, including American ginseng, which I'll just dip my toes into and share an example of in a moment, this requires shade. It's a shade obligate plant. So we're looking at somewhere between $15,000 and $35,000 an acre for that infrastructure just to get up and running to grow a crop of ginseng or golden seal or black cohosh or any of these other medicinal plants that come from the forest of Appalachia. The other opportunity that presents itself is that we can just use the existing forest lands, and that so-called quote of carrying costs is that we have to help the landowners figure out how they do that successfully and how they make it at least so that they can carry that land forward. That is, they don't go bankrupt doing this, right? In the process of doing that, we teach them about forest ecology. And so very much, I mentioned earlier that I am in the forestry department. We are thinking and engaging with people about how they interact with their forest. First and foremost, everything from how you identify the species that are growing there, to thinking about the principles of forest succession and how you go from open field conditions to a forested stand. And so I don't mean this to be anything except for, this is part of the learning curve in ethnobotany and agroforestry these days, is really working with the landowners to help them engage in a broad suite of issues that involve not just the plant or mushroom they're interested in, but how you manage the system, which is a very complicated system. Okay? And we often think about the diversity of these systems. So, for example, people are harvesting sap in the state that I'm in Pennsylvania, oftentimes maple sap for maple syrup production. And they use systems like this, which are bucket systems, or systems like this, which are tubing systems. And so understory plants can be married with other products that are coming from the trees. And one of our biggest industries then here in the Northeast is maple syrup production, but there are other trees such as black walnut, beech, and sycamores that other people are also experimenting with as sap yielding species. The management that people do is also going into biomass production, and so they raise mushrooms. And so that's a big part of agroforestry here in the Northeast, as well as figuring out which mushrooms have to be managed as non-timber forest products, but which ones can be grown independently, for example, on logs as biomass. Okay. And that brings us to kind of just a couple of quick case studies that I wanted to mention and show you some of the ethnobotanical work around. The first one comes from the temperate zone, and that's with American ginseng. The short story is American ginseng is a native forest species to Eastern North America, and yet is cultivated and has been for about 100 years. Because of the unique kind of demands of the plants, most of the harvest of the wild ends up as an export commodity from North America and is still very much in demand at higher and higher prices, in fact, most years. And so what that has meant is that as American ginseng has kind of declined, not just because of harvesting, but also just because of changes in land use and forest types and so on, that more and more people have become interested in managing and growing as an agroforestry crop, American ginseng. For about the last 22 years then, I've been working on American ginseng and different aspects of it as an agroforestry crop here in the northeastern United States, and specifically in Pennsylvania. This is an agroforestry scenario right here where all of these ginseng plants are being grown. You can see there's some straw laid down under sugar maple trees, by and large, in Western Maryland. Okay, and the main reason that people are interested in doing that is because the wild looking product, and wilder the product looks, the more valuable it is given the market that many people are looking to sell into. And so the difference between shade grown ginseng and artificially shade grown ginseng is tremendous. And I'm going to share a parallel in just a few minutes with cacao in Belize. So we've got this very different kind of product that is grown in a very different way, that has different kind of market demands from consumers in different parts of the world, right? So again, I won't get into too much detail except to say I can send anybody papers of interest, but I just want to point out that, starting way back in 2009, then one of the things that we started to do is look at the economics of some of these systems, right? So thinking about how people can grow these things as non-timber forest products using agroforestry here in Appalachia, starting to look at how they can be successful, and so evaluating different site conditions and so on. And so this is all very much, I think, part of modern ethnobotany, is really trying to figure out where are the knowledge gaps, right? This is in an interdisciplinary kind of field that we're in. And so it's really kind of, if I'm interested in assisting people and conserving a plant, what are the questions that need to be answered? And in my case, two of the very real questions early on that I found with growers and landowners and agency personnel and so on, is people needed to figure out, was it profitable? And they needed to figure out where they could grow this stuff. So that was a couple of the questions that I dipped into and published about very early on. And this is what agroforestry can look like. And so some of the people who produce American ginseng successfully grow it in these types of systems, in raised beds, in forests. This is a garden from Wisconsin, for example. And so this can be mechanized in some cases. A lot of interesting and colorful characters. Here's a couple of my greatest collaborators that I work with in Appalachia. These guys, again, would never call themselves agroforesters or forest farmers, and yet that's exactly what they're doing. They practice a very complicated forest management that, follows a lot of the boxes I try and teach landowners about, including things like crop tree selection and thinning and putting biomass down on the forest floor to, retain those nutrients and build organic matter. And they end up with these fabulous ginseng crops in the understory. And so in many cases, some of my work has been just about studying the people who do this work and bringing their stories to the light, as I'm doing right now with you all, and as a matter of policy in the state of Pennsylvania, so that folks like this essentially don't get so much policy on top of them that they can't do this kind of agroforestry practice. And so these guys produce it as if it's a wild plant on forest lands, very financially successful, and have been doing this for 30 plus years. This is what their forest farm looks like. It's multiple layers of trees in the overstory that are being managed for, a mid-story of blackberries in this case, which they're managing for fruit. And in the understory, ginseng. Those are the yellow plants that you see there, all being intentionally grown in a diverse and intensive kind of system. Okay, and there you can see an example. Okay, I'll just quickly end this because I want to leave some time for discussion. This piece of it, and then I want to just kind of share a couple of parallels from the tropics by saying that there is an effort that I'm involved with right now to kind of share a lot of this information at the federal level. So in 2024, there'll be a new manual that's published by the National Agroforestry Center. I've been leading a chapter development on forest farming, the practice I was just sharing a little bit about. It'll be coming out in 2024, and it features profiles of about 180 different species of trees that can be used in all these agroforestry practices. And so the idea is to mainstream agroforestry here in the United States And I think as that happens, even more opportunities for ethnobotany and ethnobotanical research are going to open up, not just with non-timber forest products, but with, understanding how this fits into new and maybe old views of landscape management, right? Traditional ecological management and so on. Okay, I know we're not going to take up the whole time here, but I just want to kind of dip my toes into what's now going on with agroforestry, at least in my world, which is I'm also doing some work in the neotropics. So I just wanted to share a little bit about how I view agroforestry as fitting in, into multiple different kind of hemispheres, if you will. So this is wild cacao in Belize, where I'm also working on a project with some folks down there. And one of the ideas is not very dissimilar to ginseng that I just shared with you right now, which is this is a wild cacao tree that was identified on a preserve down there and mapped out. And as it turns out, short story is this is a very unique genetic type, and it has a very unique fat content. And so this particular property is being kind of developed, if you will, into a wild cacao agroforestry scenario, right? And being used as a model for how you might do multi-story cropping, as it's referred to down there in Belize, using cacao as a vehicle. And this is something that's getting a little traction. You can see it on a lot of chocolate bars, for example, as shade-grown coffee has become popular. We see cacao is now being promoted as well in the tropics and neotropics as potentially a diverse understory species that can be used in these forest and agroforestry systems. And so once again, I just point out that, we have this parallel between what's being done in the temperate zone and the types of things we see in Belize. So this is where I'm working in Be Free in southern Belize. And you can see that they've got multi-story cropping going on with cacao in the undermost layer, and banana and other trees above that. Part of our project down there is very much about looking at the non-timber forest products that are native to that part of Belize and understanding with our local collaborators which ones would be of interest to grow in agroforestry systems. And so again, parallels between temperate and tropics. Okay. Additionally, again, I showed you this is a ginseng system in Wisconsin. They're doing a very, very similar type of production with some of these native cacao varieties in Belize. So here is an understory that's been thinned, and some of these improved, if you will, local cacao variety cuttings have been planted in here to grow as an understory species. So again, you can start with an open field and plant cacao in that with other trees, or you could actually thin the understory and plant cacao in the understory. Both of these are being investigated in the part of Belize where I'm working. And final thing I'll share with you then is that part of what those folks in southern Belize want to do is borrow from some of the best of what's going on across the Caribbean with non-timber forest products. And so I'll just quickly share with you some pictures from St. Lucia, studying back there in 2016, some of the products that people do in these systems that feature cacao and other species would include bananas and plantains in the mid-story layer, coconut trees in the overstory layers, yams in kind of the mid-story, understory layer, taro in the understory, and oh yeah, vanilla up the sides of the trees. And so again, all of these are non-timber forest products or kind of potential non-timber forest products that could be grown together in cropping systems in agroforestry systems. And all of these yield abundant questions in terms of how you piece them together and what's in them and all those sorts of questions that we think about as ethnobotanists. And final mention I'll make then is our product in Belize is to improve upon some of the work that's being done down there to promote agroforestry in the southern part of Belize as a conservation land use practice, and to use some of the indigenous species that are found down there as the woody components in these alley cropping and forest farming systems, as well as to discover non-timber forest products that might be managed in these systems. If any of that is of interest, I'll end by saying that we just concluded a series of outreach events. And so that's a big part of what I do in my position here at Penn State University, is not just study and teach about these systems to academics, but also do a lot of outreach with the public. So this past year, we've been doing forest farming webinars, and the last one just concluded on Thursday. And so I feel a strong need to say that ethnobotany, as I started out by saying, has, I think, a lot of relevance. It's more than just building plant lists, but it's got a lot of relevance to a lot of interests that we see popping up these days, even in a place like Pennsylvania, around foraging, land use, sustainable development, niche products and income, all these sorts of things. And so one of the ways that I think ethnobotany can be more visible is by getting out front of some of these issues, or at least participating. And in this case, knowing that there's a lot of interest in foraging in Pennsylvania, I'm using this as an opportunity to kind of insert ethnobotany and agroforestry and that sort of thinking into what's going on out there, and encourage people to think more carefully and intentionally about what they're doing with these different products. So if anybody's interested in, figuring out or hearing more about agroforestry and some of the products that we've been teaching about, this series is available. I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Eric. In the interest of time, I was maybe gonna ask a bunch of my own questions and we can discuss, and then open it up to the chat. But I think in the interest of time, I'll just ask one question. And then for our listeners, if anyone has any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I can read them and go through them as Eric is talking. And so for the rest of the time, people, because I know we have people from all over the world, can raise questions, and we can try to discuss and answer them as best as we can. So my question I have is, it's a common place for ethnobotanists to be kind of the go-between between agencies like the USDA or the U.S. Forestry Service and private landowners and forest landowners and that kind of thing. And you talked a little bit about your collaborators and your Appalachian landowners and stuff. And how did or do you approach landowners, private landowners, or stakeholders to work with you or to buy into this whole agroforestry thing? How did you first approach them, and how do you approach people and work with them to do this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll just talk a little bit about my philosophy, and I think it's a widely shared philosophy in this group for sure, but maybe not in the broader academia. Which is to say that I was trained as an undergraduate, trained in anthropology and botany, focused on ethnobotany to be fair, to not have kind of a colonial mentality, as we would call it these days, to not focus on things like commercialization and biopiracy, as a matter of process, but rather to treat everyone as equals, right? And to be transparent and open and to listen to people. So not to go in and start throwing your weight around, but rather to listen to what people are saying are the real questions, the real needs need to be addressed, the real things that they need, those sorts of things. So, these are all questions that I've kind of been trained in to do international work, at the invitation of others. So working in Belize, for example, I don't go in there and pretend to know how to do agroforestry in Belize. I'm a student in Belize, but I'm working and trying to empower the folks that I'm working with to actually take the torch and drive it themselves. And so I very much have that kind of approach here in Appalachia. And sometimes that means that I need to hit the pause button. It's very easy for me as a Pennsylvanian, for example, to take for granted some of my fellow Pennsylvanians. So, for example, to talk down to them because, for example, I might not agree with their politics, or maybe I don't agree that they should be cutting down their forest, or whatever it might be, right? So I've had to kind of just train myself to think about, really, people are people, no matter where you go. And you have to treat everybody with the same kinds of principles of respect and decency and transparency and ubri, right? Or should I say lack of ubri, right? Not that arrogance that I know everything, but rather I'm here to kind of listen and kind of learn as well, right? And so big part of our project in Belize is no different than our project here in Pennsylvania, which is, we go in and the ginseng growers have a set of questions and issues that they're dealing with, and policies that they're constrained by, or they'd like to see the government supporting them around. That's no different than folks in southern Belize that are trying to do cacao agroforestry. Everybody's got kind of the same needs and drives, and so I try and be as I guess equitable and fair and non-judgmental as possible. And I say that because I am a teacher here at Penn State University, at a land-grant university, and I often in class discussions have to remind students and myself, that it's easy to dismiss someone because of their politics or because you don't agree with them and that sort of thing. But we all have to listen to one another, right? And that means that, the folks that I showed the picture of that are growing ginseng here in Pennsylvania, Cliff and Randy, we would disagree on many aspects of policy and politics and that sort of thing, but we've been working together for 20 years because we fundamentally respect one another. And I appreciate the trust that they put in me to do the research that I do with them, right? And so that doesn't change, I guess. And so I maybe that's a winded way to respond, but I guess I'm trying to link it together between the work I do here and the work I do elsewhere, that I approach it no differently, that I, try and have a respect for people no matter who they are and where they come from.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Because working with like fellow Americans in rural pockets of Appalachia, it can call to mind a different image than like going into the Amazon rainforest and working with, an indigenous tribe with completely different values, and an understanding of the world. But the principles of respectful ethnobotany still hold even in those areas. We have a question from Ricky. Ricky, it's nice to see you again. I think we met at the conference this past summer. He has a question about the cacao, that wild cacao that was discovered. And is there any genetic diversity in these new cacao forest farms using cuttings from that wild cacao tree? Are they introducing it, using it like as a source of germplasm in these new in these cacao forest farms?
That's a great question. So let me rewind and say, I didn't get nearly into the depth about how this has come about, this project of Penn State and Eric Burkhart working in Belize, but let me just fill you in because it is pertinent to answer your question. For those who don't know, Hershey, Hershey Chocolate Company, it makes all kinds of candies and is well known for chocolate. They are based out of Pennsylvania, Hershey, Pennsylvania, in fact, so central Pennsylvania. So we actually have a large cacao manufacturer in Pennsylvania that works with, we could say rightly or wrongly in their approach with different cacao producers and has all over the world for many decades. And so they're very much interested in supporting projects that support producers of cacao, regardless of whether they're buying from them or not. At least that's their position. And so you couple that with the fact then that I have colleagues here at Penn State University who focus on cacao genetics as a result, because they've been working with Hershey Company for decades to understand what's going on in the genetics of cacao out there, and in certain lineages of cacao that are being used in agroforestry and in cacao plantations around the world. And one of the things that they're particularly interested in is this idea that much of the cacao that is brought into a place like Central America is cacao that has been developed somewhere else and then grown somewhere else. So, for example, Africa. And so they've got these workhorse kind of lineages that are clones in and of themselves that are being taken to other parts of, the new cacao growing regions and started up. And so the idea is that it's kind of interesting, ironic, and yes, sad that a lot of the indigenous cacao strains that are found in places like Belize aren't making their way into cacao production down there, but instead these clones that have been developed in other parts of the world are actually being planted in these systems where cacao is now being investigated as a land use, right, in Belize. So that's a little bit of the backstory. And so the idea is to use these local genotypes or regional genotypes in these efforts moving forward, whether that means hybridization efforts or just developing unique strains that are unique to Belize and retaining those as Belizean strains. And yes, the short answer to your question is the concern is there right now of not overly leaning on clones or a limited number of clones to move this whole enterprise forward with, but rather to investigate genetic diversity concurrently with, right? And so the folks that I work with here at Penn State that are in the genetics world, they're working largely with, I think, University of Tennessee, and then this entity, NGO that I work with, Be Free down there, to evaluate, everything from like how much diversity is in these Belizean populations to how much clonal diversity do we have out there as we start to kind of take cuttings and propagate them, to how do we start to do controlled hybridization in some of these clones, with which ones, right? So there's 4 different color phenotypes that have been identified in the pods of the cacao. And so that's being investigated right now. So it's very much just getting underway as to how you use these local genotypes in these systems. And there is a very real concern about relying on clones and clonal propagation in and of itself. So that's a long-winded way to say, yes, getting started, and there's a lot of concerns around genetic reductionism.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Our next question is from David Ochum, who I think is based in Uganda. There's a question about translating this to Uganda. So the forests in Uganda are protected areas. And so he asks, how can we promote forest farming or agroforestry in Uganda? And are there specific plants of commercial value that can grow in forests?
That's a huge set of questions there. But I will say this, that has been pretty much my last 20 some years of work here in Appalachia, which is to say, when I first came here and started doing agroforestry at Penn State, I was very much the only person that was even talking agroforestry. And now we're 24 years later, and agroforestry is now something that we have a position for at the Natural Resource Agency that serves our state of Pennsylvania. They're called the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. So in 20 years, we've gone from agroforestry not even being a word and non-timber forest products not even being given thought, to now having a dedicated personnel at the state level that works with all of these different non-timber forest product industries and different agroforestry kinds of NGOs to make sure that it's happening on the ground. I mention that because it really comes about through connections and perseverance. You get it out there, and especially in this day and age, people are really starting to recognize the importance of biodiversity, of retention of traditional ecological knowledge, right? All these things go hand in hand. Agroforestry, to some people, sounds like this kind of new practice, but as we all know, this is a traditional practice, right? Agroforestry is a traditional practice. And so we are really just talking about trying to mainstream a traditional set of practices. And that just means that we have to make it something that people relate to, and that they can see what its relevance is to their particular land. And so I'm saying all that because the answer to your question, I really can't answer as an outsider. It really comes down to what type of forests, what type of products people are interested in there, what type of infrastructure exists both from an economic standpoint, but also from a an extension, as we would call it, resourcing standpoint. So the ability to transfer knowledge and technology. And so I would say I can't answer that question, but it's dependent on, no matter where you go in the world, kind of embedding yourself at the grassroots level in what are the forest types that are there or landscape types that are there and the products and opportunities that are there. And then looking as ethnobotanists around those and looking at the context, policy, economy wise, and figuring out what the best path forward is.
Yeah, sounds like, yeah, understanding the situation in that ecosystem, the situation of the people there. And it sounds like you're kind of suggesting to start with the government agencies. Like you have people, you know the interest, you know the crops that people are interested in, and then starting with like the DCNR here in Pennsylvania and getting them on board with the importance of these plants or these forest crops. Is that
That's one. I would say connecting the dots is really what I'm speaking to in a bigger picture. So over the last 20 some years here in Pennsylvania and the mid-Atlantic, as we call it, of the United States, it's really been just a slow process of connecting the dots, of connecting people's mind with the term agroforestry, and then connecting that back to the relevant players, the Department of Agriculture, the natural resource agencies, academia, the landowners and the resources that the landowners deal with here in Pennsylvania, again, some of the agencies and so on. So it's a lot of connecting the dots and figuring out which dots need to be connected. And so I had a student who's working, for example, remotely trying to figure out which plants are important non-timber forest products in West Africa. She's a graduate student at Antioch. And she's a Liberian, and she's finding that the best way to kind of connect those dots is really to just kind of try and connect with the herbaria. There's not a lot of them, but the herbaria in a lot of those countries are really the people who know which non-timber forest products are the ones that are of interest to populations at the local level, right? So it just depends on where you're working, but it's all about making those connections, I guess, is what I would say.
Yeah. And that goes back to, the role of the ethnobotanist as kind of the go-between, right? Or the connector between the traditional knowledge, the invested groups of people, and government agencies, policymakers, that kind of thing. Yeah, that's great. So we are at noon. If people need to hop, I don't know what your schedule is like, Eric. Do you have a few extra minutes?
Sure, yeah. If there's a few more questions, I'm happy to stick around. Sure.
Yeah, we have a few more questions, so people can stick around if they'd like. But it will probably wrap up pretty soon. So thank you for everybody for joining and attending. Our next question is from Juliana, who's from Colombia, and she wants to ask about how good sovereignty practices can be paired with the generation of sustainable economic growth in local communities like the Amazon or other tropical countries.
Yeah, well, that could be its own hour-long discussion in and of itself, of course. I guess I'll just share from my perspective, what I'm trying to do. It does go back to some of the things I've alluded to, or if not outright said, which is trying to treat everybody with respect and paying attention to kind of, how ethnobotany operates or should operate in the modern world, right? It's no longer about just going in and studying how people use things, taking that knowledge and using it for one's own career advancement or for commercial gain. Nor is it for going in and taking cacao genetic resources, right, like I was just mentioning from Belize, and transplanting it to another country. It's approached from a much more equitable and respectable basis. And so to the question of sovereignty, I'll just say what we're doing in the areas that I work with. So another project I have going on with Christina Douglas, who's at Columbia University, is in Madagascar. And the way we approach both Madagascar and the way I'm approaching Belize is no different than how I approach Pennsylvania. And that is essentially to recognize that, the knowledge and the resources are the product of the people that I'm working with. and that I'm there at the invitation of the people that I'm working with. And again, I say that, give you a quick anecdote. Here in Pennsylvania, I showed you the picture of Cliff and Randy, the ginseng producers. It took them 10 years of showing up to different workshops that I would do in their part of Pennsylvania to actually contact me and invite me to visit their ginseng forest farm. And whenever I finally got there and started talking to them, they essentially told me that it took them 10 years to figure out that I could be trusted, essentially, right? And so that's no different, I guess, than many other populations that I've worked with and continue to work with, which is to say, I'm an outsider even to my fellow Pennsylvanians here. I walk into a forest land in Pennsylvania, it's at their invitation. It's, something that I treat with a lot of respect. And again, it could be that we don't share a lot of the same politics. We don't share some of the same ideas or terminology. I try and set that aside and recognize that I'm there because they invited me to be there. And the science that I'm trying to do is an objective science that really is just trying to answer questions that they're bringing up that are valid and reasonable, if not downright, as we would call it, juicy questions, right, that they're bringing to the table. And so the sovereignty part comes in with, what is done with that knowledge, right, at this point. And so it depends on the populations that I'm working with, the landowners I'm working with that we're using as research sites, as to how they want to be acknowledged, as to how we move forward. So in Belize, for example, with the agroforestry work we're doing, we're involving the local landowners and communities and NGO property that we're working on and based out of in the production and writing of the Belizean agroforestry manual that we're putting together as a product. Here in Pennsylvania, any of the research that we do that involves, let's say, populations that are found on a forest farmer's property, those folks are at the very least acknowledged. It can get tricky because when we get into places like Pennsylvania, a lot of folks don't even want to be acknowledged because they don't want folks to know where they are. They're afraid that if we even put their name out and list them as a ginseng grower in Pennsylvania, or let's say Center County, Pennsylvania, that somehow they'll be discovered and somebody's going to go steal their ginseng. So that's a whole nother story, but theft of ginseng is a very real issue with that particular non-timber forest product. And so sometimes it's really a matter of just asking them whether they want to be acknowledged or not, and how that knowledge is to, be maintained, right? How do they want to be included in that body of knowledge? Some of the folks just want us to share it with others. And so what I mean by that is if it's not proprietary, the sovereignty of the knowledge is that they allow me to take a lot of pictures and to collect this information because they think other people need to be doing it. That it does represent a sustainable kind of livelihood or future or conservation, and they're happy to share that with others. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that there's no one way that I treat sovereignty, but it just, again, goes back to respect for the populations that I'm working with and asking them at the outset exactly how we're going to move forward with this body of knowledge and, exactly, and the resources that are being developed, essentially.
Yeah. The next question is from Nishant Gaurav, and he's asking, it's more of an ecological question. Do you see a problem arising within these agroforestry systems between plants because of water stress or competition stress within these agroforestry systems? And if yes, how do you manage that?
Excellent question. I thought that was gonna go in a different direction question-wise. I'll just touch on that in a moment, but I guess I would say it depends on where you are in the United States and the world as to whether drought stress would be something we need to consider in some of the agroforestry systems. Here in Pennsylvania, we're blessed to have enough rainfall. I won't say it's tropical, but enough rainfall that we don't have to generally worry about it much. That said, the practice I mentioned that I work with, forest farming, often utilizes native stands of trees or natural stands of trees, if you will. So the stand is already there. And that means that we try and read the landscapes to understand how we pair the understory crop or crops with where the trees fall in the landscape. And so what I mean is we kind of say, is it a drier area on the landscape, or is it a wetter area on the landscape, or is it somewhere in between? If it's wetter, then we might plant ramps, a type of wild onion, because they like a wetter site. If it's more on the mesic side, we might plant ginseng because it's a drier area, but it's not super dry, right? So we're often pairing the crop to the site conditions rather than thinking about, the drought stress that we're going to maybe see whenever we plant these things. And so I would say that that's the challenge with agroforestry in general, is thinking about how these system elements are going to integrate. Remember the 4 I's I talked about. One of the words is how they integrate together. And at the very least, we talk about in agroforestry that they shouldn't detract from one another, right? So at the very least, they should be benign, and hopefully they are interacting in a positive way. A great example would be a leguminous woody species, right? A leguminous woody species that fixes nitrogen. That nitrogen then is used for fertility on a particular crop. Well, that's a positive benefit, right? So we could get positive benefits. And as you're suggesting, if we have a shallow rooted species in a drier area, it could actually create drought stress on understory species. So that could be a negative benefit. And so we don't want it to be negative. We would like it to be positive, but at the very least, we would enjoy it if it's somewhere in that middle zone where it's neither positive or negative. And that means we carefully think about how these systems fit together, oftentimes using nature as inspiration.
Right. And I think our last question is from Kenneth. Hi, Kenneth. His question is about the voucher specimens. So are voucher collections of germplasm and market products being made? If so, where are they being stored? And do you see a use for such collections in education and outreach?
Excellent question. Great question. Yeah, so, as a traditional ethnobotanist, I guess, we use herbaria collections. We make herbarium collections. We have an herbarium here at Penn State. It's got about 140,000 specimens. We've got 2 major herbaria in the state of Pennsylvania, Carnegie Museum of Natural History, huge collection in the Academy of Natural Sciences out of Philadelphia. These are all collections that we try and deposit into as well as make use of in our work. And we both document our work through those collections. And also, as I just suggested, we actually use the collections in some aspects of our research. So, for example, I have a student who's studying the genetics and the morphological kind of evolution of American ginseng and looking at the influence of unconscious selection on the evolution of American ginseng, especially as it's become an agroforestry species in the last 100 years in North America. And so she's using extant populations, yes, to be able to look at the morphometrics of what she's looking at, but she's also dipping into the digital as well as physical collections that exist. Again, the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia has ginseng specimens going back to the early 1700s. From Pennsylvania. So she's able to use those collections backwards, right, to be able to look at morphological evolution over the last 300 years. So I think there's tremendous amount of use to these collections, and we try and contribute to the collections with everything that we do. All of the research that we do, not just the genetics, but we do a lot of phytochemistry. I really didn't get into that today, but we study what's in these plants and can they be used to develop new products that are commercial or informally used. These all need to be vouchered and curated. And the approach really is to leave at least a set of specimens at any host institution and then bring one set of specimens to Penn State. That's our goal anyway, if we are permitted to do that and have all the scientific permits in place. So what that means here in Pennsylvania is that we document not just specimens for Penn State collections, but we also deposit them at the Carnegie Museum as well as the Academy of Natural Sciences. And for work that's done in places like Belize, we'll be depositing at the universities down there. The place that we're working, Be Free, also has their own herbarium collection, and then we'll be depositing specimens back here at the Pack Herbarium. So making sure that we are spreading this stuff around and making sure that anybody that wants us to be documenting specimens in their country or in their region and putting them in relevant institutions, we do that. Savannah, you are muted.
Awesome. I think that's all of our questions. And so I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks everyone again for coming. I see that Daniel Mormon is here also, and I just wanted to thank you especially for coming. I know you're an absolute legend in ethnobotany, and it's great to see you even virtually. I've spent a lot of time reading your book and your ethnobotanical dictionary. And it's great to meet you even digitally. Yeah, and we've had a great turnout. Thank everyone for coming. And thank you, Eric, for sharing your expertise.